Year 1985. In the distant Andes, two young British climbers, Simpson and Simon Yates, decided to do something extraordinary. They were determined to conquer the western side of Siula Grande, a huge and dangerous peak in the Andes. Their story is not just a tale of adventure and human endurance, but of survival, courage, and a decision that changed their lives forever. Simpson and Simon Yates were already experienced climbers in their early 20s and eager to leave their mark in the world of mountaineering. They belonged to a new generation of climbers striving to conquer the most difficult peaks in the world. The Peruvian Andes, with their remote and harsh beauty, attracted them more than anything else. Siula Grande, at 6,344 meters, was particularly appealing. Only a few climbers dared to attempt to climb its western side, a steep wall of ice and rock that was considered virtually impossible to ascend. In May 1985, Joe and Simon arrived in the small mountain town of Huaraz, ready to begin their ascent. They carefully planned their route, gathered equipment, and prepared physically and mentally for the climb. Their goal was simple: to climb the western side of Siula Grande and return alive. On the morning of June 13, 1985, Joe and Simon set off. They went in alpine style, carrying only the most necessary supplies and equipment on their backs, moving very quickly. Unlike traditional mountaineering, which uses fixed ropes and established camps, alpine style requires speed, but comes with risk. It leaves no room for errors. Initially, the weather was favorable, and on the first day, the guys made quite good progress. They steadily climbed upwards, using ice axes and crampons to cling to the frozen surface. The snow was deep, the air thin, but they kept moving. After several days of intense climbing, they reached a point just below the summit. The mood was upbeat. They were close to achieving their goal. On the morning of June 18th, Joe and Simon reached the summit of Siula Grande. The view from the top was breathtaking, endless expanses of sharp peaks and deep valleys stretching beneath them. For a moment they felt triumph. They had done it. They had conquered one of the most difficult peaks in the Andes. But reaching the summit is only half the journey. The descent, as every climber knows, can be just as dangerous, if not more so. The weather began to change. Clouds were gathering. The guys understood that they had to move quickly to descend safely. As they began the descent, Joe and Simon encountered difficult conditions. The snow was too soft, complicating the descent. Visibility was greatly reduced. Now they had to move slowly and carefully, but they didn't doubt they could descend safely. And then disaster struck. On a steep slope, Joe lost his balance. One of the crampons, those metal spikes attached to boots, slipped and he fell. Joe rolled down the slope, gaining speed until he stopped abruptly. His right leg hit a rock hard and he felt a sharp, burning pain. His leg was broken, and at such a height this was a death sentence. Joe panicked. He knew that with a broken leg, his chances of leaving the mountain were extremely slim. But Simon didn't want to give up and abandon his companion. He made an improvised splint for Joe's leg so they could continue the descent, but it wasn't that simple. The climbers developed a plan. Using a 45-meter rope, Simon lowered Joe down steep slopes 45 meters at a time. Then he would descend himself, and they would repeat the process. It was slow, exhausting work, and the weather was getting worse at the same time. The wind howled terribly, and the snow fell more actively, hindering visibility. They were exhausted, freezing, but kept going. Many hours passed unnoticed, and night fell. Now it was completely dark, and Simon could barely see the end of the rope. He lowered his companion Joe into the darkness, hoping they were still on the right path. And then the unthinkable happened. Simon lowered his friend over the edge of a cliff. Now Joe was hanging in the air right above a huge crevasse, a deep crack in the glacier. He tried to shout to Simon, but the wind drowned out his voice. They were stuck in a very awkward position. Joe's weight was pulling the rope down. Simon, not understanding what had happened, fell into despair. He felt the weight of his partner's body pulling them both down. His hands were freezing and strength was leaving him.
The climber faced an unimaginably difficult choice. If he continued to hold the rope, sooner or later they would both fall and die. But if he cut it, then he had a chance, but Joe would most likely die. At that moment, Simon made a decision that haunted him for the rest of his life. He took out a knife and cut the rope. Joe fell into the darkness. He fell into a crevasse, dropping about 30 meters before landing on a narrow ice ledge. Miraculously, he survived the fall. The guy found himself in a huge ice cave in cold solitude and excruciating pain. He knew Simon would consider him dead. Joe realized that he had only two options: wait for death or try to find a way out. He decided to fight for his life. Using an ice axe, Joe began to crawl deeper into the crevasse, looking for a way out. The cold was unbearable, and the broken leg made every movement torturous. After several hours of crawling, he noticed a beam of light in the distance. It was an exit, but it was far up above. With incredible determination, Joe raised the ice axe above his head and plunged it into the ice wall. Using his only healthy leg and the ice axe, he slowly pulled himself up. Each movement caused waves of pain, but there was no other way out. He had to endure. Incomprehensibly, the climber managed to get out of the ice cave, which, however, did not yet mean salvation. Now Joe was on the glacier, several miles from their base camp. His leg was useless, and he had no food or water. The day spent in the crevasse was already coming to an end. The sun was setting, and the temperature was dropping. He needed to keep moving, otherwise death from hypothermia was certain. Joe continued to crawl. For the next 3 days, Joe crawled across the seemingly endless glacier. He dragged himself inch by inch in unbearable pain. Dehydrated and exhausted, the climber began to experience hallucinations. At times he heard voices in his head or thought he saw people who weren't there. Meanwhile, Simon had already reached the base camp. He was devastated, believing Joe was dead because of him. But it was the only choice he could make, even though it was hard to accept. Simon waited in the camp for several days, hoping for a miracle, but eventually accepted the fact that Joe wouldn't return. But his injured companion wasn't dead and was still crawling. On the third day, Joe saw the base camp. He shouted as loudly as he could, exhausting all his remaining energy. And Simon heard him. Simon couldn't believe his ears. He ran out of the tent and saw Joe, exhausted, beaten and barely alive, crawling towards the camp. Together with another climber, Richard Hawking, they rushed to the survivor and dragged him to the tent. Over the next few days, Simon and Richard nursed Joe as best they could. They fed him, gave him water, and kept him warm. As soon as Joe stabilized, they set off on a new difficult journey to the nearest village where they could get help. Joe was eventually taken to a hospital where he had surgery on his broken leg. What happened next? The story of Joe Simpson and Simon Yates became one of the most incredible survival stories in the history of mountaineering. Joe's book, Touching the Void, which he wrote, became a bestseller and was later made into a film. The story raised many ethical questions about mountaineering and the difficult decisions that climbers sometimes have to make. Joe never openly accused Simon of cutting the rope. He understood that his friend had no other choice. Both men continued to climb after this ordeal, although they never did it together again. Joe's story is a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the will to live against all odds. It reminds us that in the most desperate situations, hope and determination can change everything. Please write your opinion in the comments. How would you act in Joe's friend's place in a similar situation? Is his action justified if it threatened him with loss of life? Subscribe to our channel for new interesting stories about survival and disasters. Take care of yourself. Bye.